In the summer of 1922, a grading crew was cutting the foundations for the largest private house in America. They were working on a ridge that rose 1,600 feet straight out of the California coast, a place the owner had already started calling the Enchanted Hill. The plans called for them to blast the crown of the ridge down to bedrock, level a platform, and pour footings deep enough to hold a structure that would eventually weigh more than most cathedrals. That was the job. Cut down, hit rock, pour concrete. But somewhere in that summer, according to accounts that were never supposed to leave the hill, the crew stopped hitting rock. They started hitting stone that had been cut by hands, dressed blocks, fitted tight, sitting in a layer of reddish sediment that had no business being there, far below the line where the natural soil ended and the granite of the mountain began. And the strangest part of the story is not what the men found, it is who owned the ground they found it in, because the man who held the deed to that hill was not just wealthy. He was, at that exact moment, the single most powerful controller of printed information on the planet. He owned more newspapers than anyone alive. If there was one man in the United States in 1922 who could decide what the public would and would not read about a discovery, it was the man standing on top of that hill. His name was William Randolph Hearst, and this is the story of what the record says his workers pulled out of the ground before the concrete went in, why almost no one has ever heard it, and what it might mean if even part of it is true. I want to be honest with you about how I came to this, because it matters for how much weight you give the rest. I was not looking for a lost civilization. I was looking for concrete. Specifically, I was reading through the architectural papers of Julia Morgan, the engineer and architect who designed the estate. She was a remarkable figure in her own right, one of the first women to train as an architect at the Great Paris Academy, the first woman ever licensed to practice architecture in California, and by any measure, one of the most disciplined structural engineers of her generation. Her papers are held today in a university library archive on the central California coast, box after box of drawings and ledgers and letters, kept with the same care she brought to the buildings themselves. I was trying to understand the water system she built on that hill, the reservoirs and the springs and the pressure engineering, because it was genuinely ahead of its time. That was the whole reason I was in those boxes. What I found instead was a gap, and around the edges of that gap, a set of small, strange documents that did not fit the tidy story of a rich man building a mansion, a regrading order that changed the foundation depth partway through the season, a note about material being removed from the site rather than brought to it, a workman's brief account folded into other correspondence, describing something the men uncovered that the account calls, simply, the old floor, not a floor they were building, a floor that was already there. The account is short, almost offhand, the way people write when they are describing something to someone who was there and does not need it explained. A few lines, folded into a page about other matters. It mentions the men clearing to a depth they had already passed on the plans and coming down onto a surface that was flat and hard and laid. And it uses that phrase, the old floor, as if the crew had already given the thing a name among themselves. That is the detail that stayed with me, not the discovery, the casualness of it. You do not invent a name for something you found once and never saw again. You name a thing when you have been standing over it for days. None of it, by itself, proves anything. I will say that again before we finish, because it is the most important thing I can tell you. But once I saw the shape of it, I could not unsee it. So let me walk you through the whole thing, the way it actually unfolded, and you can decide for yourself where the line is between coincidence and cover. Start with the man, because you cannot understand the hill without understanding him. William Randolph Hearst was born into a fortune that came out of the ground. His father, George Hearst, was a Missouri farm boy who became one of the greatest mining men in American history. George Hearst had an almost supernatural instinct for what lay beneath the surface. He was in on the Comstock lode in Nevada. He owned pieces of the Homestake mine in South Dakota, the Anaconda copper operation in Montana, the Ontario silver mine in Utah. Silver, gold, and copper. The Hearst money was extraction money. It was wealth pulled up out of the dark, out of tunnels and shafts, out of the parts of the earth that ordinary people never see. That is worth sitting with for a second, because the family relationship to what is underground runs through this entire story. The Hearsts did not make their money on the surface. They made it by knowing that the real value was below and by controlling access to it. The son inherited the fortune, but he did not go into mining. He went into newspapers, and he did not just run newspapers, he weaponized them. By the turn of the century, Hearst had built a media empire that stretched across the country: the San Francisco Examiner, the New York Journal, eventually dozens of papers, magazines, wire services, newsreels. At his peak, something like 1 in 4 Americans got their news from a Hearst publication. He is the man historians credit, along with his rival Pulitzer, with inventing what we now call yellow journalism: sensational headlines, manufactured outrage, stories designed not to inform but to move. There is a famous line attributed to Hearst during the run-up to the Spanish-American War. When one of his illustrators in Cuba reported that there was no war to cover, Hearst is supposed to have replied, "You furnish the pictures and I will furnish the war." Whether he said those exact words or not, the sentiment was real, and it captured something true about him. Hearst understood, more deeply than almost anyone in his era, that reality is not what happens. Reality is what gets printed. Whoever controls the printing press controls what an entire nation believes is possible. Hold on to that idea. Whoever controls the record controls what is possible, because that is the thesis of everything that follows. Now, the hill. Hearst had known that ridge since he was a boy. His father had bought up enormous stretches of the California coast around a place called San Simeon, and the family used to camp on the hilltop in tents. Hearst loved it there. He called the whole property Camp Hill for years, and when his mother died and he came into the full fortune, he decided he wanted something more permanent than tents. According to the story that everyone knows, he called Julia Morgan into his office in 1919 and said he was tired of camping out and he wanted to build a little something. That little something became the largest private residence ever constructed in the United States. Julia Morgan spent nearly 3 decades on it. The main house alone, the one Hearst called Casa Grande, has more than 100 rooms. There are guest houses, each one a mansion in its own right. There are the pools, the gardens, the terraces, and filling all of it, packed into every hall and room, is one of the largest private collections of antiquities ever assembled by a single person. This is where the official story and the questions start to rub against each other, because Hearst did not just decorate the house with old things. He bought entire ancient structures and had them shipped across the world and rebuilt on that hill. The most famous example, the one anyone can go and verify, is the pool. The main outdoor pool on the estate is fronted by the facade of an ancient temple. Real columns, a real carved pediment. Greco-Roman antiquities, centuries old, standing on a ridge in California as if they had always been there. He bought carved wooden ceilings out of Spanish palaces and Italian churches, whole ceilings, and installed them overhead. He bought Roman sarcophagi. He bought medieval choir stalls. And in the gardens, standing in the open California sun, he placed a set of ancient Egyptian statues of the goddess Sekhmet, the lioness. Those statues are real, and they are genuinely old, not 19th century copies. Statues carved more than 3,000 years ago, on the far side of the world, sitting quietly in a rich man's garden on the Pacific coast. And he went further than statues and facades. A few years later, Hearst would buy an entire medieval Spanish monastery, a Cistercian abbey called Santa Maria de Ovila, have it taken apart stone by numbered stone, and shipped across the Atlantic in something like 10,000 crates. 10,000 crates of a building, packed and labelled and sent to California. When money reaches a certain scale, a building stops being a place and becomes cargo. It becomes an inventory of numbered stones that can be sent anywhere, unpacked anywhere, and given whatever history the owner chooses to write on the crate. Hold that image, 10,000 numbered stones with paperwork that says where each one came from, because it shows you exactly how easy it is, at that level of wealth, to make a stone say whatever you need it to say. The official history has an answer for all of it, and it is a completely reasonable answer. Hearst was an obsessive collector with nearly unlimited money in an era with almost no rules about the antiquities trade. He bought this material on the open market, through dealers and auction houses, all over Europe and the Mediterranean and Egypt. He shipped it home. He warehoused so much of it in New York that he had entire buildings full of crates he never opened. That is the standard story, and there is real documentation behind a great deal of it. But here is the question the workman's account forces you to ask. What if not all of it came from over there? What if the reason a man builds a private mountain, 1,600 feet up, behind a locked gate, and fills it with ancient stone, is not only that he loves buying ancient stone? What if the collection is also camouflage? What if the safest place to display something you found in your own ground is in plain sight, surrounded by 100 other ancient things, all of them with paperwork that says they came from somewhere else? I am not telling you that is what happened. I am telling you that once you know what the men said they hit, you cannot look at that garden the same way. So let us go back down into the foundation. To understand why the discovery mattered, you have to understand what the crew expected. This is a granite ridge. The geology of that part of the coast is old and hard. When you cut a foundation into a mountain like that, you expect a simple sequence. Topsoil, then weathered rock, then solid bedrock. You blast, you clear, you pour. There should be nothing in that sequence that a human being made, because no human being was ever supposed to have built anything up there before Hearst. According to the accounts, the sequence was wrong. Below the topsoil, before they reached clean bedrock, the crews came into a layer that did not belong. A band of fine reddish and ochre sediment, the kind of deposit that water lays down, not the kind a mountaintop produces on its own. And sitting in that band, or just beneath it, were the dressed stones. Blocks with flat-worked faces, fitted edges. Set without mortar, the way the oldest and most precise stonework in the world is set, stone locked to stone by the accuracy of the cut alone. Now, if you have spent any time in the corner of history this channel lives in, that description just set off an alarm. Because a layer of water-laid sediment sitting on top of worked stone, on top of a structure, below the modern ground line, is the single most important physical claim in the entire body of alternative history. It has a name. People call it the mud flood. Let me explain what that means for anyone who is new here, and let me do it honestly, including the reasons mainstream researchers reject it. If you travel through the old cities of Europe and Russia and parts of the Americas, you will find a strange recurring detail. Buildings whose ground floor windows are half buried below the current street. Doorways that now open below grade. Ornate arched openings at the foundation line that look like they were meant to be full windows on a proper first story, except that story is now underground, and you have to walk down a flight of steps to reach a door that was clearly once at street level. You can see this in 1,000 places if you start looking. The official explanation is ordinary and, in most individual cases, correct. Cities rise over time. Streets get repaved, layer on layer. Rubble accumulates. Ground level naturally creeps upward across centuries. The alternative reading says something far stranger. It says that a great deal of the world was buried, relatively recently and relatively fast, by an enormous flow of mud and sediment. A cataclysm, or a series of them, that swallowed the lower stories of an older and more advanced civilization. And that the story we were given afterward, the story of pioneers and empty land and humble beginnings, was written on top of that buried world, like fresh paint over a water stain. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. The believers have a word for the civilization they think was covered over. They borrow it from the old maps, the maps that for centuries labelled a vast stretch of Asia with a single name that then vanished from the modern atlas almost completely: Tartaria. I am not here to sell you Tartaria as literal fact. I want to be clear about that. As a specific empire with the exact borders the enthusiasts draw, the mainstream case against it is strong, and I take that case seriously. But underneath the more extreme claims there is a smaller, harder question that will not go away, and it is a question about the record itself. It is the question of why so many grand structures were attributed to people and eras that seem to have lacked the tools, the labor, and the time to have built them. It is the question of the orphans. Because that is the pattern that actually pulls people in, not the maps, the orphans. An orphan structure is a building that does not have a convincing parent. It is a courthouse in a frontier town of 4,000 people, raised in 18 months, apparently, that carries stonework. A modern crew with modern tools would need years and a fortune to reproduce. It is a state capitol or an exposition hall of impossible scale and ornament, credited to a young country that supposedly had almost no skilled labor and no time. Think about the great world's fairs. The 1,893 fair in Chicago produced an entire city of enormous neoclassical palaces, gleaming white, domes and colonnades, and sculpture across acres of ground. They called it the White City. And then, we are told, almost all of it was pulled down within a couple of years because it was only ever temporary, built out of a plaster and fiber mix over wooden frames. An entire monumental city, razed and erased inside a few seasons. The official history is, again, perfectly coherent. It was staff, a cheap, moulded material. It was meant to be temporary. It was demolished on schedule, and some of it burned. That is all documented. But the revisionist looks at the photographs of that vanished white city and asks a simpler, more human question. Where did the design capacity come from, in that quantity, that fast? Where did the workforce come from? And why does so much of what we are told was temporary and disposable look, in the photographs, more permanent and more skilled than what we build to last today? You can dismiss the answer these people reach for. Plenty of it deserves to be dismissed, but the underlying discomfort is real, and it is not stupid. It is the discomfort of a person who has looked closely at old buildings and cannot square the caption with the object. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. There is more to the pattern than scale, and this is where it gets stranger. The same body of research points at the shapes of certain very old fortifications, the star forts, those precise geometric works with points radiating out like a compass rose, found on nearly every continent, built to a standard so consistent it can look almost industrial. It points at the copper domes and the tall iron spires on old public buildings and asks whether they were only ornament, or whether an earlier system had learned to draw something usable out of the atmosphere itself, and whether that knowledge was among the things that got covered over. I am at the far edge of what I can defend now, and I know it. But the through line is always the same, and it is not really about any single machine or spire. It is a suspicion that the people who came before us knew things we were later told they could not have known, and that the forgetting was not entirely an accident. Now, put the enchanted hill back into that frame. Here is a man whose entire family fortune comes from knowing what is underground. Here is a man who has spent his life mastering the one skill that matters more than any other in this story, which is the manufacture of public reality through control of the printed word. Here is a man who chooses to build his monument on a remote private mountain, behind a gate, at the top of a hill his family has owned and camped on for decades, in a spot he personally selected. And here, in the one season when the ground is being opened to its deepest point, the men who are digging say they came into a buried layer of water-laid sediment sitting on top of worked, mortarless stone. If the mudflood claim is nonsense everywhere else in the world, it is a strange coincidence that the workman's account describes exactly that signature on exactly that hill, in the possession of exactly the one man in America best equipped to make sure you never read about it. And there is one more detail in the accounts, the one that is hardest to sit with and the one I can least verify. Some versions of the story say the men did not just find a flaw. They say the regrading order was issued because the crews had opened a void, a space below the platform, a stair cut into the sediment and the rock going down, warm air moving out of it, which is a detail that appears again and again in these buried structure stories, from the American Southwest to the stone chambers of New England, air with a temperature that does not match the mountain around it, as if the space it comes from is connected to something larger and deeper than a single small cellar. I have to stop here and give you the reasons to doubt, because if I do not, I am doing exactly the thing this channel is supposed to be against. I am furnishing you a war. Here is the honest case for the skeptic. The physical estate is real and open to the public, but this specific discovery is not in the official record. The construction of the estate is one of the best documented private building projects of the 20th century. Julia Morgan kept meticulous files. There are ledgers, letters, thousands of pages. And in all of that mountain of paper, the discovery of an ancient buried structure is not announced, not photographed, not catalogued. What I found was a gap and a handful of ambiguous documents around its edges. A gap is not a chamber. A workman describing an old floor could have been describing a natural rock shelf, or an earlier and perfectly ordinary structure, or nothing at all, misremembered and recopied by other hands before it reached me. The reddish sediment could be a completely natural deposit that any geologist would explain in a sentence. Warm air can come from ordinary ground. And the biggest problem of all is the one that should always make you cautious in this field. Absence of evidence is being used here as if it were evidence. The believer says, the silence in the archive proves the cover-up, but silence proves nothing on its own. Most gaps in most archives are just gaps. People lose paper. People never write things down. A missing document is the weakest possible foundation to build a hidden history on, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you something. So that is the honest flaw of this story. I cannot show you the chamber. I can show you a gap, a pattern, and a man uniquely capable of creating exactly that kind of gap on purpose. But let me turn the skeptic's own argument around one time, because this is where the economic history actually lives, and it is the part I find genuinely hard to shake. Every other orphan building in the world has the same problem for the debunker. The record is controlled by the people who benefit from the standard story, and in almost every case, that control is diffuse. Governments, academies, museums, publishers, all loosely pointing the same way, so that no single hand can be blamed, and the whole thing can be waved off as coincidence rather than conspiracy. It is genuinely hard to imagine the machinery that would coordinate a cover-up across so many independent institutions. The Enchanted Hill is the one case where that objection collapses, because here the machinery is not diffuse, it is one man. You do not need a conspiracy of 1,000 museums to bury this. You need a single owner who happens to control a quarter of the newspapers in the country, who happens to own the land, who happens to control the payroll of every man who was standing in that foundation, and who happens to have inherited both a fortune and a worldview built entirely on the principle that what lies underground belongs to whoever controls access to it. Every condition that makes the standard cover-up story implausible everywhere else is, on this specific hill, satisfied by one signature. That is the economic argument, and it is bigger than one estate. Think about what a fortune actually buys at that scale. It does not just buy the object, it buys the caption. Hearst could purchase an ancient Egyptian statue and set it in his garden with a label that said, "Bought in Cairo, shipped by such and such dealer," and that label becomes the truth, because he owns the presses that would ever print anything different. The wealth does not only acquire the past, it acquires the authority to say what the past was. The label on the stone is not a fact discovered, it is a decision made by the person who can afford to make it stick. We like to imagine that the past is fixed, that it sits behind us, finished and unchangeable, a thing we can only discover and never edit. But the past is not made of stone, it is made of records. And records are made by people, kept by institutions, and paid for by whoever has the money to keep them. Change who holds the paper, and you slowly change what is remembered. That is not a theory about a lost empire. That is simply how the writing of history has always worked, in every century and every country. The only thing the Enchanted Hill adds to it is a single owner powerful enough to do the whole job alone, in the open, with a museum eventually built on top of the evidence, and a tour that points politely the other way. And this is the deepest layer of the whole Tartaria question, the layer that has nothing to do with lost maps and everything to do with money and power. The real claim is not that there was a magical empire. The real claim is that history is an economy. that the story of the past is a form of property, owned, traded, and defended, and that whoever accumulates enough wealth and enough control over the record can quietly rewrite the inventory of what human beings were ever capable of. If you can convince a whole civilization that its ancestors were simpler and weaker than they were, you can convince it that the present arrangement, the one that made you rich, is the natural peak of everything that came before. There is nothing to reach back and recover, because there was never anything there. A buried, advanced structure under the foundation of the largest private house in America would be a small physical fact, but it would be a crack in that arrangement. It would say the inventory is wrong. It would say someone, at some point, built at a level the official story insists is impossible, and that the level was covered over, literally covered, in sediment, and then covered again, in paper, by the man who poured his monument on top of it. So what happened to the stones? If the accounts hold, the answer is the most mundane and the most chilling one available. Nothing dramatic, no dynamite in the night, no sworn men, no melodrama. The regrading order changed the depth. The material was removed from the site, quietly, as ordinary spoil. The foundation was poured, and the largest private house in America rose up over whatever was down there, and the collection filled the halls above it, hundreds of ancient things with clean paperwork, so that if any single old stone ever did surface in a photograph, it would vanish instantly into the crowd of all the others he was known to have bought. The perfect hiding place for one anomaly is a mountain of catalogued antiquities. The perfect cover for a discovery is a famous, documented obsession with collecting. And the man himself never had to lie loudly. He only had to not print. That is the terrible efficiency of it. To bury a story, a normal person has to do something. Hearst only had to do nothing in the one arena where he controlled everything. The most powerful act of censorship available to the most powerful publisher on earth is simply the decision to run something else on the front page. Hearst died in 1951. The estate passed to the state a few years later and became a museum, and millions of people have walked through it since. They walk past the temple facade at the pool. They walk past the Egyptian lioness in the garden. They stand in rooms roofed with ceilings lifted out of European palaces, and they are told, correctly, that a fabulously rich man bought all of this and brought it here. And that is true. It is just possibly not the whole truth. Possibly the whole truth is standing under their feet, in the footings, in the fill, in the parts of the hill the tour does not go. I told you at the start that I would come back to the most important thing, so here it is. I do not know. I have a gap in an archive, a pattern that fits too well, and a man who was, of everyone in his generation, the single most capable of producing exactly this kind of silence. That is not proof. That is a reason to keep looking. If you take one thing from this, do not take a belief. Take the question. Take the habit of standing in front of an old and impossible thing and asking who wrote the caption and what it cost them to make you believe it. Because the fortune on that hill came out of the ground. The father knew that the real wealth is always underground, and the son knew that the real power is always in the record. On the enchanted hill, for one season in 1922, those two truths met in the bottom of a foundation trench, and then the concrete went in. The stones, if they are there, are still there. They do not need us to believe in them. They have been patient for a very long time, waiting for someone to come and reread the ground the way it was written. The newspapers have all yellowed and been thrown away. The presses have gone quiet. But the foundations do not forget what was underneath them. They never do. They are only waiting for someone with a shovel and no reason to lie. Make of that what you will.